We're going to continue to follow the saga of Joseph Bates. As we talked about last time, Joseph Bates was a person who was active in the society of his time. He was also very active in the Millerite movement and then in the early Adventist movement. So he's a key figure in these early years. I want to start with a quote from him. We will eventually go back earlier than where he gives this quote. But he's in the midst, when this question and answer go on, in the Millerite movement, and in about 1843. And he says in his autobiography that many of his friends who were involved in reform came to him and said, well, why are you not attending the meetings that you always were faithful in attending and also leading out? And he gives two replies, which run throughout all of the period that we're going to be talking about. First, my reply was that embracing the doctrine of the second coming of the Savior, I found enough to engage my whole time in getting ready for such an event and in aiding others to do the same. So that's the first answer. I've got a lot to do in helping everybody get ready for the second coming of Christ. And so that sounds as though the second coming of Christ and the involvement in it was antithetical to social reform. But he has a second answer that comes right after that. And I answered, all who embraced this doctrine of the second coming would and must necessarily be advocates of temperance and the abolition of slavery. Let me repeat that. All who embrace this doctrine, square brackets, of the second coming of Christ, would and must necessarily be advocates of temperance and the abolition of slavery. And those who oppose the doctrine of the second advent could not be very effective laborers in moral reform. So what is he saying? He's saying, look, right now, I've got my hands full because of the second coming of Christ. But in principle, those who want to be involved effectively in abolition of slavery and temperance should embrace this doctrine of the second coming of Christ. And those who are opposed to the doctrine of the second advent could not be very effective laborers in moral reform. So, reform and the second coming go together. And that's what we're going to be looking at in here. What is the relationship of reform to the second coming? You've read by this time an essay that I wrote on that topic. That essay is really discussing more what happens after there is not a second coming to those people who have been waiting for the second coming with reference to health reform and all the other reforms. Today, I want to talk about how reform can lead to the expectation of the second coming. It did for Joseph Bates, and it did for a lot of other people in New England particularly, and in upper New York State, what is sometimes called the burned over district, because there were so many revivals that created harvests and so on. And there was a fire of Pentecost that raged through upper New York State. So that whole northeastern part of the United States combined a concern for reform in society with an expectation of the Lord's return. What we're dealing with here is change. And for Americans, back to the 18th century and beyond, change was very, very important. After all, the Puritans had changed their whole lives, and they had gone across what they considered to be the equivalent of the Red Sea, and have left the equivalent of Egypt in Europe to come to the Promised Land in the United States. That was a huge act of changing their lives. Come to the 18th century, and you have people like Thomas Jefferson, who felt that revolution was the form of change that was needed, hence the American Revolution. And Jefferson, endorsed the French Revolution. Not all the founding fathers did, but he certainly, at least initially, did. He even said that the tree of liberty must sometimes be watered by the blood of martyrs. Now that's a person who is convinced of the value and importance of change, and in his case, sudden change. His younger associate, back in the 18th century and on into the early part of the 19th century, James Madison, had a more moderate view of change. And in that view of change, society improved from being very primitive to what he called a polished nation. He got these terms from the Scottish Enlightenment. He'd studied at Princeton with John Witherspoon, who had been born and raised and trained in Scotland, and came and became the president of Princeton. He studied with him as a graduate student. And this whole idea that there was change, but it should be moderate change, was something that stayed with him all his life, on into the early part of the 19th century, 1820s even. And he, in that idea of moderate change, saw the importance of what we would call voluntary associations. He liked the idea that the leader of a party, if he was dedicated to helping the whole society, could become that more exalted figure, a reformer. Now that's a term that is very important for our discussion today. Reform. Reform. This was a term that in the 1820s in the United States and into the 1830s described mass movements that were changing the basic fabric and values of America. It was sometimes identified with Jackson, who became president during this time, as over against the established figures in Virginia and New England. But it was something that, as I say, James Madison would have approved of in certain respects at least. One of the historians that recently, at least a few years ago, Dr. Commager, says this was a day, this Jacksonian period of 1830s up to the Civil War, it was a day of universal reform, a day when almost everyone you met might draw a plan for a new society or a new government from his pocket, a day of infinite hope and infinite discontent. So this period of the early 19th century, prior to 1844 and the rise of the Adventist Church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, was, in society as a whole, a time of great ferment. This was a time, of course, when the established churches, even in New England, had become disestablished. And so we had New England divines who realized that the church wasn't controlling the state and therefore couldn't use the state to maintain the health of the morals of the people, and they got worried. So what was their answer? Their answer was voluntary associations. The church needed to set up various groups that would help reform the morality of the society. And so they started creating these various organizations and these various associations. There was a family that became involved in revivals in New England who also became involved in these voluntary associations. This was the Beecher family. Henry Ward Beecher, and then his son Lyman Beecher, and his daughter Harriet Beecher, who married a man named Stowe. So does that name mean something to you, Harriet Beecher Stowe? This was a family that was very concerned with the problem of liquor, and so they were anti-liquor. They also became people who were very concerned about slavery, so they were anti-slavery. And hence, Harriet Beecher Stowe, later in the century, writes the great book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Lincoln said had revolutionized America. Now, there was another major figure in this period, Jacksonian America, 1820, 1830, up to 1840, and that is Charles Finney. Now, Finney was a Presbyterian. But he adopted what was called new measures. And this meant that he, as a Presbyterian, identified himself with people who were revivalists. In the Great Awakening back in the 18th century, that had been brought by people with the Methodist tradition. But here was a Calvinist who was using new measures. And what was new measures? Well, it was using publications to spread invitations to join the Christian church. Finney, like the Beechers, and like Wesley in the century before, and the evangelists who followed Wesley, was very concerned not only with the conversion of individuals, but the reform of society. And so again, he was totally committed to temperance, and he understood temperance to be total abstinence. So within temperance, if you're for total abstinence, you're a radical reformer, and he was. He saw no discontinuity between his evangelism to convert people to Christ, people who were perhaps in name Christians but not really dedicated to Christ. He saw no discontinuity between that kind of evangelism, or what he called new measures, and his trying to get everybody to be committed to total abstinence, to what we would call as a part of health reform. But he was, along with the Beechers and the Quakers, a person who was opposed to slavery. He also was very interested in educational reform and work-study programs. This was attempts to provide avenues for poor people to work and earn enough money so that they could pay for going to school, and therefore improving themselves. He was also committed to equal rights for women. Towards the middle or latter middle part of his life, he decided that he would settle down, which he did, in Oberlin College, which was a place that was organized by these reformers who were reforming ways of communicating the gospel, but also reforming how people lived, and they were committed to reforming society. So at Oberlin, gradually this college, which he joined because some of his backers had created it, and they made a place for him, and he became a dominant figure at Oberlin College, they adopted health reform as we sometimes talk about it. That is, certain ways of eating and living, identified with Sylvester Graham, also a Calvinist, who mixed religion with his view of what a diet should be. And as you know, it led to an emphasis on whole wheat bread and on what became famous as the Graham crackers. There was also no alcohol allowed at Oberlin College, no tea, coffee, spices. And at that point, people got a little nervous that things were getting a little too fanatical. But the point here is that the religious figures, after the disestablishment of the churches, at least those religious figures in the Northeast, New York, New England, turned to reformatory societies who were advocating not only Christianity and rededication of one's life to Christ, but also dedication to reform of not only their own lives, but of the whole society. And it's in that milieu where Joseph Bates, our hero here in the beginning part of this course, decides that he's going to become a Christian. And so he's baptized into the Christian connection, or the Christian church. Those were terms used synonymously. And he helps to build in his community of Fairhaven / New Bedford a church for the Christian connection, the Christian church. He puts a lot of his own money and resources into it. He becomes a person who is asked to preach in different congregations around in that general area, not only in his home church. And simultaneously, he is involved in these societies that we talked about before, and I just want to remind you of. In 1827, he creates the Fairhaven Temperance Society. In other words, reform in a healthful way. That was a key initial way in which he got started in reform. And that Fairhaven Temperance Society became a part of the Massachusetts Temperance Society, which became a part of the National Temperance Society. But it hadn't existed in Fairhaven, New Bedford, until Joseph Bates got it started. He also started the Fairhaven Seamen's Friends Society for moral improvement of seamen, and then the Fairhaven Anti-Slavery Society. And he took into the Anti-Slavery Society 40 people, most of whom were sea captains, former sea captains. And he saw no discontinuity. In fact, he saw a very deep continuity between his becoming a member of an organized church, congregational in organization, however, not denominational or like the established churches, Presbyterians, Methodists, and so on. But he saw no discontinuity between joining the Christian connection in the Christian church and establishing these societies, temperance, Seamen's Friends, anti-slavery. And as you know, he himself did what they were doing at Oberlin right about the same time, the very same time, setting up manual labor school on his property. And as we talked about before, he started developing mulberry trees and silkworms. Now, just to move ahead slightly on the way in which Joseph Bates continued to be involved in these kind of social reforms, right through the time that he became a major figure in the Millerite movement, as late as 1846 to 1848, this is after the Great Disappointment, he takes a stand against the war with Mexico, because the war with Mexico, he understands, is a part of a plot to extend slavery into the West. And so he calls it a heaven-daring, soul-destroying, slave-holding, neighbor-murdering country. He's calling what that? He's calling the United States of America that, because it has the temerity to carry on this kind of war. And as we'll see, he was a person who knew William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the great antagonists of slavery, who was also an antagonism to war. And that we won't talk about sorting out this time, but we will in later lectures. So then, what is the connection between social reform and the Millerite Adventists, those early Adventists, not yet Seventh-day Adventists, but early Adventists? It's very interesting if you look at Joseph Bates' autobiography, and ultimately I hope you get a copy of that book. It's not going to be hard reading, and it is just one adventure after another, an adventure of a person who is gaining greater and greater knowledge of his relationship to God, at the same time that he's getting greater and greater knowledge of the scope of what people committed to God should do. So he says in his autobiography, while the subjects of anti-slavery and pro-slavery were agitating the Union, a wonderful phenomenon occurred in the heavens. Well, that's the shower of stars, and it is the sun being darkened. Those classic portents of the second coming among the early Adventists. But he's saying, in the same sentence, while the subjects of anti-slavery were agitating the Union, a wonderful phenomenon occurred in the heavens. And then he says, just 3 pages later, he says, in connection with these portentous signs in the heavens, moral reform was working its way like leaven across the country. What's common to all this is change. And Joseph Bates is emerging in an America where change has been important for us, ever since the 18th century, where it's seen as the very fabric of one's existence. And he is pushing change. He feels that God is wanting him to improve the society and himself as well. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that change in moral reform built up to the second coming. Now, you've been reading an essay of mine where you wrestle with, well, what comes after the non-appearance of Jesus? But here we're looking at how moral reform led up to the ultimate reform. In fact, that's what some people have talked about the second coming of Christ as being. So that rather than a discontinuity between reform, including health reform, with the second coming, it laid the groundwork for an appreciation for a second coming that would reform everything. So Joseph Bates tells us how he got involved with the Millerite movement. In the fall of 1839, he says, while engaged in my orchard, now those were mulberry trees, right, that he had planted in order to get off this scheme of helping young people to grow silkworms and then silk. So while engaged in my orchard, an acquaintance of mine and a preacher in the Christian Connection, of which he was a part, called upon me and inquired if I would like to go to New Bedford, about 2 miles distant, that evening and hear him preach on the second coming of Christ. Now, he doesn't say who that person is, but he went. And he listened, and he took his companion, as he refers to his wife. And after the meeting, he's riding with his companion, presumably in a horse-drawn carriage. I broke the silence, he said, by saying, that is the truth. So he immediately got a hold of William Miller's evidence from Scripture and the history of the second coming of Christ, a collection of his lectures, and he became a convert to Miller's saying that the second coming of Christ was just around the corner. One of the early Adventist historians, Everett Dick, said that Bates was the earliest of all those who later became Seventh-day Adventists to embrace and participate in the Advent movement. That is what the Millerites were doing. Now this brings us to a person that Joseph Bates met in New Bedford, the Fairhaven, New Bedford area. A person named Joshua V. Himes. And this becomes very important. His relationship with Himes draws Bates into this, in addition to what he reads from William Miller. Who was Joshua V. Himes? Joshua V. Himes was the son of a well-known West India merchant in New England. And they were part of the St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and they expected that Joshua, their son, would study at Brown University and join the Episcopal ministry. But the Himes family lost their fortune. And so Joshua was apprenticed to a New Bedford cabinet carpenter maker. And while there, he joins the Christian Connection instead of the Episcopal Church. And he becomes a preacher for them. And in 1827, he becomes ordained as a minister in the Christian Connection. And in 1830, when he's 25, he's called to a bigger church, namely a church in Boston that meets at Chardon Street, called the Chardon Street Chapel. Now, at 25, and you will have or if you haven't already, seen a picture of Bates, and you'll be seeing a picture of Himes. And hopefully you'll see one when he was young and not just when he was older. Because at 25, He was good looking, he was energetic, and he threw himself not only into the life of the church, and he built that church up till it was filled every week, but he plunged into a whole series of things that some people today might think is not the work of the church. But he had no idea that it wasn't a part of the church. Why? Because Christian Connection people were involved in this whole grand task of bringing moral reform to America. So, he threw himself into temperance work. He threw himself into work-study programs, educational reform. He threw himself into anti-slavery, became acquainted with William Lloyd Garrison, the foremost abolitionist in America. They became lifelong friends. And he served on the board of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. He got involved in women's rights. His wife became an officer in the association dealing with women's rights. And because I'm assuming, because William Lloyd Garrison was a major proponent of peace along with anti-slavery, he joined Garrison in peace efforts. Now, it was in the 1840s that Himes became acquainted, as did Bates, with the work and the writings of William Miller. And he invited Miller to come to the Chardon Street Chapel, and he was well received there, William Miller was. And so they started thinking about what they might do with helping William Miller. But I just want to point out that Joshua V. Himes, Christian Connection pastor, friend of another Christian Connection religious leader, Bates, continued even after he became involved with William Miller and the Advent movement. He continued to be involved as a committee member of the Non-Resistance or Peace Society. He was a counselor of the Anti-Slavery Society through the 1840s. He was a lecturer for the temperance cause. In 1840 itself, he convened a major conference at his Chardon Street Chapel called the Friends of Universal Reform. And who was there? Well, William Lloyd Garrison was there. Bronson Alcott was there, who was a social reformer. Theodore Parker, a preacher. James Russell Lowell, who belonged to the Lowell family, a very prominent family, and a poet. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, than whom there was no witcher in Boston. He was a theologian, a philosopher, an essayist, and he came. And they were all talking about universal reform. Himes told them at one point, "Those who are always pulling down Babylon, but know not how to lay a single brick in building the walls of Jerusalem, should be ashamed of themselves." In other words, he was an activist because he was motivated by Christian convictions and the belief that God expected this world to be renewed and reformed. But by the end of 1840, that same year, Himes emerges as the major promoter, manager, financier of the Millerite movement. He helps to get several different publications organized. He comes up with the idea of a great tent, and he got a believer to create this largest tent ever made in America that could hold 4,000 to 6,000 people. 6,000 if you had people sitting in the aisles. And this tent then started going around at least the eastern part of the United States, the northeastern part of the United States, and brought out lots and lots of people. This is the same person, however, the major figure in organizing the Millerite movement, the people who were expecting Christ to return. He continued to be involved with moral reform. Early in 1844, he goes to New York City, and he says that we must go out, and he said this at a big rally, we have to go out to those whom no man seems to care. He said, these must be hunted out and comforted with the promise of the new heaven and new earth. Millerite, right? He also said, quote, at the same time, we must do all that we can to relieve their pressing temporal wants. So you see, what I'm arguing over and over again in this talk is reform led up to the greatest reform of all, which is the second coming of Christ. There wasn't a tension between reform and the second coming of Christ, except in the time spent by people who were at the heart of the Millerite movement. Yes, they focused in on helping people to know about the second coming of Christ, but that they didn't see as antithetical to reform. Now let's get back to Joseph Bates, who became, some people say, the leader of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He at least was one of the leaders. Excuse me. By mid-1840, he was a circulation agent for the Signs of the Times, one of the major publications brought out by the Millerite movement. Then there were a series of conferences held, 1840, 1841, 1842, of bringing together all of those who were leaders in the Millerite movement. And in the first one of these, Bates is listed as one of 16 people who are drawing this conference together. 1841, he's the assistant chairman of the conference. 1842, at the third General Conference of Millerites, Bates is the chair. He has become that prominent in the Millerite movement. And so it's at that time that they decide that 1843, at that third General Conference session, it is that time that they decide that 1843 was the year in which the Lord would return. Now later they passed it on to 1844, but they were now ready to set a date at least of a year. Bates and Himes and all of them were reluctant, the leaders were reluctant to set a time, but at that conference where Bates was in charge, they decided that they would actually name a year. That same year, 1843, it's the year after that conference, but in 1843, if you look at Bates's autobiography, he takes a very interesting trip to Maryland. He goes as both an anti-slavery advocate, somebody who established a society in his area against slavery, somebody who's been a friend of Himes since before Himes came to Boston and on through the times that Himes is a leader in reform in Boston, including anti-slavery. He takes a trip to the South, what was called the South. It's now called the Eastern Shore, and was then, of Maryland. And Maryland was on the border. And they had slaves and colored people down there. And he arrives, and those who know him and know his reputation, they assume that he's coming to be an anti-slavery advocate. Now, it's interesting, when he has meetings with some of the leaders, he says, I'm here to try to tell you about the second coming of Christ. But he doesn't disown the fact that in principle he's against slavery. He just says he's not down there this time to try to get their slaves to come north. And he makes a major effort to go out and see the black people and to preach to them. So, again, for some of these people like Bates and Himes, getting involved with the Millerite expectation of the second coming did not mean that they turned their back on social reform. And it's the thesis of this presentation that in fact it was social reform that led them to embrace the ultimate reform of the second coming. But then you know that there was the great disappointment. no question about it. And Hiram Edson and James White, whom Bates met late, actually. Hiram Edson has one of the most poignant, and longest lasting responses to the disappointment of those people who had sold, many of them had sold their farms. Bates did, and so did others. They did not get into ascension robes. That's been disproven. But here's what Hiram Edson said. Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came over us as I have never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of all earthly friends could have no comparison. We wept and wept till the day dawned. James White also talked about his feelings after the great disappointment, and interestingly, it shows his respect for Himes. He said that when Elder Himes visited Portland, Maine, which is where the Whites were, a few days after the passing of the time, the great disappointment, and stated that the brethren should prepare for another cold winter, my feelings were almost uncontrollable. I left the place and wept like a child. So in both discussions, there is this great disappointment. It's a deep, deep emotional experience. It becomes a defining experience for a lot of them. Or does it? Is weeping and disappointment the way that these people understood themselves in the years to come? Well, that brings us up to the first vision of Ellen White. Next time we'll talk about how Bates and the Whites related to each other. But this vision of Ellen White, she experienced in December of 1844, 2 months after the Great Disappointment. And it wasn't published until the following year in the Daystar. So your assignment, basically, is to focus on this vision of hers in the light of what we've been saying and some of the materials that I've put online with my assistant, Alice Kong, which you'll get to know as well. You don't have to analyze all of those readings. Those are there just to give you some more context. You're to focus on this vision of Ellen White. And as you're told in the course outline, you're to identify metaphors in that vision. I also would like you to reflect upon what you think was the function of this vision in the experience of the Millerites. What did it do? How was it similar? How was it different from what you hear going on? Is it quite different? If it's different, is it also connected in some way? Do the metaphors help and understand that connection? Then, of course, we'll talk a lot more about the chart. The part that we've been talking about is on your chart, the Millerites. And I didn't put years in there, but it's basically from the 1820s to 1844, the period that we've just been talking about. And we'll pick up a little bit from there and then go on into the years of ferment on that chart. So, thank you for watching. I know you're required to do it. And good luck with your encounter with the reading. Thank you. Bye.